Imagine, just for a second, writing a deeply desperate, really guilty apology note to your wife.
Oh, man. That's heavy right out of the gate.
Right, but just think about it. It's this intensely private note where you confess that, your absolute obsession with your own work has literally stolen precious time from her and from your children.
Like time you can't get back.
Exactly. You are terrified of what this obsession makes you, but you also feel like you just can't stop. So you take this raw, bleeding confession, and here's the kicker. You publish it as the foreword to your brand new book.
Which is incredibly vulnerable.
It is. And then a literary doctor intercepts that book, publishes this sprawling, massive academic paper, and essentially calls you clinically insane.
Wow. Just completely bypasses the emotion.
Yeah, he labels your normal domestic guilt a, quote, pathology, and your sadness a neurosis. And, well, that exact collision is what we are unpacking in today's deep dive.
It's just a phenomenal collision, too, because it really forces us to ask what happens when deeply intimate, lived human experience meets this towering, unyielding wall of high academic theory.
Yeah, it's like a train wreck of literature and psychoanalysis.
Totally. So we are looking at two texts today that are basically locked in combat. The first is a poetry collection titled Beaming Petals in a Henna Vine.
Beautiful title, by the way.
Really is. And it was written by Narasha Gunasekara, who is a male Sri Lankan-born poet currently living as an immigrant in Melbourne, Australia.
And then the second text is the review of that collection. But honestly, calling it a review feels like the wrong word entirely.
Oh, completely inadequate word for what this is.
Right. It is a highly theoretical, just intensely psychoanalytic critique written by a prominent Sri Lankan critic named Saman Kumara, who also writes under the pen name Sarpaya.
And Sarpaya doesn't just review the poetry. He essentially, puts the poet's mind on an operating table.
Yeah, he really gets the scalpels out.
Yeah, he does. He brings in Jacques Lacan, postmodernism, these deep Freudian concepts, and he just applies all of this heavy machinery directly onto Gunasekara's incredibly personal diasporic poetry.
Which brings us to the core mission of our conversation today for you listening. We aren't just reading Gunasekara's poetry in a vacuum here.
No, not at all.
We are reading the poetry through the lens of Saman Kumara's critique to evaluate what kind of reader this critic actually is.
Right. Like, does applying a rigid European psychoanalytic framework to a Sri Lankan immigrant's poetry actually unlock its hidden depths?
Or does the sheer weight of all that theory just, crush the delicate lived reality of the poet?
I love that question. It's the central tension of the whole deep dive.
I keep thinking about it like this. If the poetry is a living, breathing butterfly, is the critic accurately measuring its wingspan, or is he just squashing it with a heavy iron ruler?
Squashing it with an iron ruler. That is a perfect visual.
Because think about the last time you sent an emotionally vulnerable text message to a friend or a partner, and instead of meeting you with empathy, they psychoanalyzed your word choices.
Oh, that is the worst. You're projecting.
Right. They tell you that you're deflecting or exhibiting avoidant attachment or whatever. It is incredibly jarring to have your actual pain translated into a textbook diagnosis.
It feels cold. It feels very alienating.
Exactly. And that dynamic, that tension between feeling something and analyzing something is basically the engine of this entire critique we're looking at.
And we really have to start right at the beginning with that foreword to the collection you mentioned earlier, because this is where Saman Kumara establishes his baseline diagnosis.
Yeah, set the stage for us. How does the critic open this thing?
Well, the critic does not pull his punches. He opens his essay with a highly provocative claim. He says Gunasekara's poetry is not merely self-expression, he actually calls it self-therapy.
Self-therapy,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. He claims the poet is fearlessly exhibiting his own pathology and his own melancholia to the world. According to Saman Kumara, the poet has rejected traditional aesthetic beauty to give us a raw psychological exposure of his own disease.
The vocabulary the critic uses is just so incredibly clinical. Words like pathology, neurosis, melancholia. He explicitly calls the book an autopsy of the soul.
An autopsy. Which implies the subject is dead,
Right. And when you actually read the poet's introduction, the contrast is staggering. Because Gunasekara writes this beautiful, tear-jerking foreword.
It's very moving. very grounded.
He dedicates the book to his family. He writes explicitly about the time he stole from his wife and his 2 children, time he took away from them just so he can lock himself in a room and write these poems.
He says he carries the guilt of his writing inside him.
Yeah, and he even notes that, like, as of the printing of the book, his wife hasn't even read the poems yet.
Which is such an intimate detail to share with the public.
Right. He says he locked them away in the, quote, dark prison cell of his heart, because he wanted her to have the fresh experience of holding the newly printed book.
It is deeply raw. And it's a very familiar kind of guilt, I think.
Any person listening to this right now who has ever tried to balance a demanding career or a passionate side project with loving their family knows this exact suffocating feeling.
Oh, absolutely. The guilt of ambition.
You want to build something, but every hour you spend building it is an hour you aren't playing with your kids. It's just the standard heavy friction of domestic life.
But the critic looks at this incredibly common human struggle and says, ah, yes, a brilliant exhibition of psychological pathology and deep-seated neurosis.
I have to be honest, I find it to be a massive academic overreach. Why does the critic have to turn the poet into a patient on a psychiatric couch?
I totally hear your frustration, and it does feel harsh. But I'm actually going to defend Saman Kumara here for a second because I think you might be romanticizing the poet's guilt just a bit too much.
Okay. Defend the iron ruler. Let's hear it.
You have to remember the foundational premise of psychoanalytic literary criticism. When a poet takes their private domestic guilt and decides to publish it in a bound book for the public to purchase and read, it ceases to be just a private apology note.
Because it's public now. It's a product.
Exactly. It becomes a performance. It becomes a text. And psychoanalysis argues that what we consciously confess usually masks a deeper, unconscious structural trauma.
So you're saying the critic is justified in looking for a disease because the poet, put himself on the examination table by publishing the book in the first place.
Yes, essentially. Freud makes a very specific, very famous distinction between mourning and melancholia.
Right. Mourning is healthy, right?
Yes. Mourning is a normal, healthy reaction to the loss of a loved one or a specific object. You process it, you grieve, and eventually you move on.
And melancholia.
Melancholia, however, is pathological. It is an inability to process loss because the subject cannot consciously identify what exactly has been lost. The loss has been completely internalized.
So it's like a grief without a clear target.
Precisely. So when Saman Kumara labels the poet melancholic, he isn't just throwing an insult at him. He is making a precise theoretical argument.
He's diagnosing the text, not just calling him sad.
Right. He is saying that Gunasekhar's endless obsessive guilt isn't just about missing his kid's bedtime. It is a symptom of a much larger, unnamed, unresolvable internal void.
The poet is bleeding on the page, and the critic is trying to find the actual source of the wound, even if the poet himself doesn't fully understand where it is.
That's it exactly. It's a very specific critical posture.
Okay, I see the intellectual rigor behind the critic's approach, even if it still feels a bit cold to me. But it really establishes a hierarchy, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A very clear hierarchy.
The poet is the raw, unanalyzed material, and the critic is the surgeon holding the scalpel who actually understands the anatomy of the mind. It's a massive assertion of power.
It is an assertion of power. The critic is essentially saying, I know the architecture of your mind better than you do.
Which is bold, very bold.
It is, but it is also an attempt to elevate the poetry. By medicalizing the text, by treating it as an autopsy of the modern condition, Saman Kumara is arguing that this book isn't just a diary of a sad dad in Melbourne.
Right. He's saying it has broader psychological importance.
Yes. He is arguing that this book is a vital document of human psychology.
That makes sense.
Huh.
And if we accept that the critic views the poet's literal family life as just a symptom of a deeper psychological state, well, it completely changes how we are forced to read the poet's romantic and observational encounters throughout the rest of the book.
It colors everything that follows.
Because if the baseline is a pathology of loss, then everything the poet desires is going to be colored by that loss. Which brings us perfectly to the critic's central thesis, which is heavily rooted in Lacanian theory.
Yes, the concept of what he calls the scattered object of desire.
This is where Saman Kumara's analysis gets really fascinating and, frankly, incredibly dense. We need to unpack Jacques Lacan for a moment, don't we?
We really do, because without him, the critic's argument sounds like total gibberish. Lacan is a French psychoanalyst.
Notoriously difficult to read, by the way.
Famously difficult. But his core idea here is that human desire is entirely driven by a fundamental lack.
A lack, like an emptiness.
Exactly. When we are infants, there is a moment, often called the mirror stage, where we recognize ourselves in the mirror for the first time.
And why is that traumatic?
Because we realize we are separate entities from our mothers. Before that, we felt like a unified whole with the universe. But in the mirror, we see we are fragmented, isolated individual.
Ah, so the illusion of wholeness is shattered.
Yes, and this realization creates a permanent, unfillable void inside us. For the rest of our lives, we search for objects or people or achievements to fill that void.
To get back to that original feeling of being whole.
Right. Lacan called the unattainable target of our desire the objet pitié, or the object cause of desire. But because we can never actually return to that original feeling of wholeness, our desire scatters.
Hence the scattered object of desire.
Exactly. We don't desire a whole person anymore. We fixate on fragments, we obsess over partial objects, a specific tone of voice, a curve of a neck, a unique flaw.
Right, because the perfect whole doesn't actually exist, so we obsess over the broken pieces.
And the critic, Saman Kumara, takes this Lacanian concept of partial objects and applies it brilliantly to Gunasekera's poetry.
He does. He really nails this part. He argues that Gunasekera actively rejects the neoliberal capitalist standards of perfect beauty and instead constantly fixates on these fragmented, flawed margins of society.
And if you look at the evidence in the poems, the critic is absolutely dead on here. Gunasekera's gaze consistently, deliberately bypasses traditional packaged beauty.
The imagery in these poems is just incredibly vivid. Think about the society we live in right now where beauty is entirely commodified.
We are bombarded with it constantly.
Exactly, just optimized, filtered, symmetrical perfection everywhere. There's a poem in the collection that directly addresses this, which the critic highlights. The poet calls them the 2436 mothers, referencing those supposedly ideal bodily proportions.
And how does the poet describe them in this scene?
He places us right outside a school, in the pickup line. The poet is watching these suburban mothers waiting for their kids, and these women are the absolute picture of capitalist optimization.
They're doing all the right things.
Oh, yeah. They are obsessed with fitness. The poet notes their Fitbit trackers glowing on their wrists, quantifying their every single movement.
The surveillance of the modern body.
Yes. They are standing around talking about their personal trainers who are working to give them a perfect V shape. They are discussing organic fruits, multivitamins, wellness routines.
They are what society tells us is the absolute peak of normative success and health.
They are the whole package. But the poet's attention does not stay on them. He actually finds them deeply uninteresting.
His gaze just slides right off them.
It does. His gaze shifts entirely away from the center of the frame and lands on a mother standing slightly apart from the group, a mother who has just had her second child.
And he focuses on her imperfections.
He describes her with milk leaking, her belly folded and wrinkled, wearing a simple faded dress. She is exhausted, frantically sorting through her tired child's messy school bag.
It's such a real grounded image.
And the poet finds the reality of this woman, her weariness, her worn-in humanity, far more compelling and beautiful than those optimized Fitbit mothers.
What is happening here, theoretically, is highly significant. Saman Kumara identifies that this is not just a personal aesthetic preference from the poet.
Right, it's bigger than that.
It is a rejection of a hegemonic norm. Capitalism demands that we desire the flawless, airbrushed whole. By focusing on what cannot be easily commodified, a tired mother's wrinkled stomach, the poet is quietly rebelling.
He is desiring the fragment.
Yes, the partial object, the reality of wear and tear.
And it happens again and again in the text. There is another poem about a girl with protruding teeth.
Oh, I love this example.
The poet describes a woman whose two front teeth jut out slightly, creating this tiny gap. He explicitly states that she is not a standard beauty by conventional metrics, but he says this tiny flaw creates an unmeaningful geometric beauty.
An unmeaningful geometric beauty. That is such a fascinating phrase.
That gap in her teeth is the fragment that has haunted his memory for years. He doesn't remember her outfit or her flawless skin. He remembers the protrusion.
And there's also the poem titled The Tomboy, right?
Yes. The poet describes a girl with short hair, a square face, wearing a checked shirt, tight denim, and white metal chains.
She has a rough, almost masculine swagger, a deep voice.
She completely defies the soft, delicate expectations of traditional femininity, and the poet is completely captivated by her.
And so the critic looks at all of this, the folded belly, the protruding teeth, the rough tomboy, and says, aha, these are Lacan's partial objects.
The poet is attracted to the margins, the nonconformists, the broken pieces. You know what it really reminds me of?
Like that.
It's the exact philosophy behind the Japanese concept of kintsugi.
Oh, yes, the pottery repair.
Exactly. When a ceramic bowl breaks, a kintsugi artist doesn't throw it away, and they definitely don't try to glue it back together with invisible adhesive to pretend it never broke.
They highlight the break.
They repair the cracks with lacquer mixed with powdered gold or silver or platinum. They illuminate the breakage. The philosophy is that the piece is actually more beautiful and more valuable because it has been broken and put back together.
The history of its wear and tear is what matters, not its pristine perfection.
When Gunasekara looks at the exhausted mother's folded belly or the girl's protruding teeth, he is doing literary kintsugi. He is finding the gold in the cracks of human beings.
That is a very elegant way to frame it. Really beautiful. The critic, using his dense theoretical language, is basically pointing out the exact same mechanism.
Just with way more jargon.
Way more jargon. But Saman Kumara notes the poet is bypassing the false whole of modern society to obsess over the authentic fragment. Which is just so true to life. Think about this from the perspective of the listener right now. Think about the people you have been genuinely, deeply attracted to in your life.
It is rarely their flawless symmetry that hooks you.
Exactly. It is usually a specific laugh, a weird habit, a crooked smile, a specific way they hold their coffee cup. We are all, on some level, searching for partial objects.
And the critic is brilliant for spotting that Gunasekara has built an entire poetic architecture around this very human reality.
Okay, so I will concede that the critic's heavy theoretical machinery is actually doing some profound work here. It is highlighting a genuine repetitive pattern in the text that casual reading might completely miss.
It's a solid win for the critic.
But acknowledging that these fragments exist is one thing. Understanding how the poet actually interacts with the women in his poems is a whole different arena.
Because it's not just about looking from afar. It's about intimacy.
Right. And this leads us to the critic's analysis of the poet's fluid male gaze and how he interacts with the quote-unquote unromantic woman.
Building on this idea of fragments, Saman Kumara takes his argument a step further into the realm of gender dynamics. He argues that Gunasekara's gaze, while undeniably male and undeniably romantic in its nature, is remarkably unjudging and fluid.
Fluid in what way?
Well, the critic claims the poet actively deconstructs standard female roles and expectations within intimate relationships. He views the poet as a transgressive figure who refuses to enforce patriarchal norms on the women he desires.
And again, the poems give us incredible, visceral material to test this theory against. Let's really unpack the poem called No Strings Attached.
This one is fascinating.
It is this incredibly quiet poem. A woman comes over to the poet's place on a cold evening, and the poet spends a significant portion of the poem telling us what she doesn't do.
Right. He defines her by her lack of traditional action.
He notes that she doesn't tidy up his messy room, she doesn't arrange fresh flowers in a vase, she doesn't fold his laundry, she isn't playing the traditional nurturing domestic girlfriend role at all.
She enters the space completely on her own terms.
Exactly. She comes in with dust on her shoes, she carelessly throws her bag into a corner, she drops her heavy wool muffler on his sofa, sits down, and immediately lights a cigarette.
Very cinematic.
The poet notes that there is no romantic fluff between them. There are no meaningless, flowery declarations of love. They just have this silent, heavy understanding.
And the exit is just as stark, isn't it?
Yeah. When it's time for her to leave, there is no dramatic goodbye, no promises of a future together, no tears. She simply checks her watch, finishes her cigarette, and walks out the door. All that is left of her is the faint, fading smell of soap on her fingertips that still lingers in the air of the room.
There is another poem that pairs perfectly with this called But Sarah.
Oh yeah, the pool hall one.
In this one, the poet is admiring a woman who drinks beer, plays pool with the guys in a bar, cuts her hair super short, and navigates her life with this easy, almost masculine-adjacent swagger.
They sit together and talk about Star Wars and Merlot wine.
And the poet finds her utterly captivating, precisely because she doesn't fit the mold of a delicate, soft, traditional romantic partner who needs to be protected.
Now, how does the critic interpret this? Because Saman Kumara reads these poems as a triumphant, postmodern rejection of gender norms.
He does. He sees the poet as a radical, almost feminist ally, someone whose fluid gaze is actively tearing down the patriarchal expectations of how a woman should behave in a domestic or romantic space.
The critic celebrates this as a high-level theoretical deconstruction.
Which aligns perfectly with the postmodern critical framework. In postmodernism, any deviation from traditional gender performance is seen as a subversion of power structures.
Right.
So the woman smoking a cigarette and leaving without cleaning up is subverting the male expectation of domestic labor. The critic is reading the poem as a deeply political act.
But I have to fiercely disagree with the critic here.
Really, you don't buy it.
I don't. And this is exactly where the theory actually blinds the reader to the emotion on the page.
Okay, lay it out for me.
The critic sees this as a triumphant, radical political statement. But when you actually read the poems, they do not feel triumphant. They do not feel radical. They feel deeply, overwhelmingly melancholic. They feel exhausted.
You're saying the critic is missing the tone entirely. Defend that. Where do you see the exhaustion?
It is in the absolute quietness of the scenes. It's in the shadows. The poet isn't standing on a soapbox shouting, "Behold, I deconstruct gender norms."
Right, he's not making a speech.
He is a guy sitting alone in a dim, dusty room, waiting for a woman to come over because he is intensely, painfully lonely. The lack of romantic fluff, the fact that she doesn't fold the sheets or arrange flowers, that isn't a radical political subversion.
It's just reality.
It feels far more like the profound exhaustion of two adult human beings who are simply too tired to play the games of courtship anymore. It is a weary, diasporic man finding brief, uncomplicated, temporary solace in basic human contact. He isn't smashing the patriarchy, he's just too tired to care about folded laundry.
Wow. That is a highly persuasive reading. You are arguing that the critic is intellectualizing a purely emotional state.
Yes.
Kumara takes the lived reality of profound loneliness and the messy pragmatism of adult relationships, and he translates it into the sterile academic language of transgressive desire.
Exactly. And the danger of doing that becomes glaringly obvious when we look at how the critic handles the aftermath of intimacy in these poems.
The objects left behind.
Right. In another poem, the poet is looking at the physical residue left behind after a woman leaves his space. He notices a discarded tampon in the trash. He describes it viscerally, like a dead body in the color of dirty blood.
Very intense imagery.
He notices a single curly hair stuck to a wet bar of soap. He sees a yellow ribbon carelessly discarded on the bedpost.
These are jarring, intensely intimate physical realities. They are the undeniable proof that another physical body was just occupying the space.
Exactly. They are the sting of absence. But the critic points at these things, the tampon in the trash, the hair on the soap, and he labels them, quote, scattered partial objects of desire functioning within a Lacanian deadlock.
A Lacanian deadlock.
And I am reading this review thinking, are you kidding me? Is the critic seriously over-intellectualizing what is simply an intimate, highly observant, deeply painful cataloging of an empty room?
He's missing the forest for the trees.
The poet is looking at the physical evidence that someone was just there, and now he is alone again. The grief is palpable. But the critic slaps an academic barcode on that grief and calls it a deadlock.
This is the eternal trap of psychoanalytic criticism and, frankly, all high-theory literary criticism. A critic's job is to provide a framework, to connect the dots, to show us the underlying architecture of a text.
Which is useful, sure.
It is. But when the framework becomes more important than the art itself, you lose the humanity. You lose the visceral reality of the poem. A tampon in the trash and a hair on a bar of soap aren't theoretical constructs. They are jarring reminders of physical isolation. The critic wants the poet to be a philosopher, but the poet is just trying to survive a Tuesday night alone in a cold apartment.
It's the iron ruler again. He is measuring the wingspan of the butterfly, but he is completely ignoring the fact that the butterfly is frantically trying to fly away.
That's a great analogy.
And this tension, this constant battle between the critic's rigid academic theory and the poet's lived, messy reality becomes even more pronounced when we step outside the bedroom.
Yes, because this poetry does not exist purely in the mind.
No, it exists in a very specific physical geography.
We absolutely have to talk about the physical world the poet inhabits,
Yeah.
because it is crucial to understanding why the critic's framework ultimately starts to buckle under the pressure.
It's not just a book about internal sadness.
Not at all. Gunasekara is an immigrant. He was born in Sri Lanka, a tropical island nation in South Asia, and he lives in Melbourne, Australia.
A completely different world.
The poetry is overflowing with distinct, vibrant, often harsh Australian imagery.
The setting is undeniable. The poet gives us cherry picking in the orchards. He gives us the blistering heat of the Gold Coast sun, where he describes girls in bikinis sunbathing on the beach like stone turtles baking in 40-degree heat.
Such a specific evocative image.
He gives us Aboriginal people playing the didgeridoo near a busy train station. He gives us an 80-year-old white man walking his dog in the freezing early morning. He is meticulously documenting his physical environment.
And we really need to focus on one specific poem to truly see how the critic's psychoanalytic lens handles this environment. The poem is called Easter Holiday.
Oh, yes. This one has one of the most striking pieces of observation in the entire collection.
Walk us through it. What is the poet looking at?
The poet describes being out in the marshy wetlands, far away from the noise of the city, and he is watching a flock of giant Australian pelicans.
Just massive, imposing birds.
These massive, prehistoric-looking birds are wading in the thick mud of a lagoon. They are moving silently, searching the muck with their huge, heavy beaks, looking for something hidden in the water.
They're methodical.
Very. They are quiet, intensely focused, and completely ignoring the humans walking around them.
Now, what is vital to know here is that in the very same book we are discussing, there is actually another essayist named Wickramaracci who offers a brief, contrasting thought on this exact poem.
Oh, right. A totally different perspective.
Yes, Wickramaracci suggests a sociopolitical reading. He argues that these pelicans represent the expatriates, the immigrants.
Like the poet himself.
Exactly. Like the pelicans, the Sri Lankan diaspora is wandering in foreign lands, endlessly searching the foreign mud for wealth, for meaning, for stability, always remaining slightly out of place, slightly alienated from the landscape they inhabit.
That is a very grounded historical reading of the metaphor. It makes perfect sense.
It's beautiful. But our main critic, Saman Kumara, how does he read the pelicans?
Let me guess. Not socio-politically.
He completely ignores the sociological reading. Entirely.
Of course he does.
Saman Kumara looks at the pelicans, and he looks at the Gold Coast and the Aboriginal people, and he concludes that all of this is merely a projection of the poet's internal angst.
He calls it a projection.
He argues that the poet is taking his internal Lacanian pathology and projecting it outward onto nature. The critic claims the poet is creating, quote, fantasy narratives in the landscape to escape his own internal neurosis.
Wow. And this is exactly where I think the critic's framework completely collapses.
It just fails to hold up.
By insisting that absolutely everything in the poetry is just a mirror reflecting the poet's internal psychological sickness, the critic effectively erases the very real physical, socio-political experience of being an immigrant. It is a literal act of critical erasure.
We need to explain exactly why this framework fails here, because it is a known, heavily debated blind spot in strictly European psychoanalytic criticism.
It's a systemic issue with the theory.
Right. Freud and Lacan developed their theories in early to mid-20th century Europe. Their models of the mind are built on universal structural concepts, the Oedipus complex, the mirror stage, the inherent lack of the human subject.
Built for a very specific demographic.
Exactly. What happens when you apply a framework built for middle-class Viennese patients to a 21st century colonized immigrant? The framework fundamentally lacks the vocabulary for physical displacement.
Right. Because in Lacanian theory, loss, or lack, is abstract. It's the loss of the feeling of wholeness from infancy. But for the immigrant, loss is not an abstract metaphor. It is literal.
Exactly. Physical distance from one's homeland creates a very specific, agonizing type of melancholia.
Moving from the tropics of Sri Lanka to the variable climate of Melbourne is a shock to the nervous system.
The loss is geographical. It is the literal loss of your mother tongue being spoken casually on the street. It is a loss of the smells of your childhood.
You cannot diagnose the grief of migration as a mere projection of internal neurosis.
You just can't. When the poet looks at a dying plum tree in his Australian backyard and compares it to his own life-rotting, unfulfilled, he isn't projecting a subconscious fantasy.
He is articulating the unique historical grief of the diaspora. He is a transplanted root trying to survive in foreign soil.
And the political observations the poet makes are so sharp.
Yes, let's talk about the train station poem.
When Gunasekara writes about the Aboriginal people playing the didgeridoo at the train station, he specifically notes the white folks dropping dollars into their hats.
He notices the Aboriginal people smiling, playing their music, despite a massive, brutal history of displacement and colonial violence.
That is not a Lacanian projection of the poet's inner void.
Not at all. He is a Sri Lankan immigrant, a man whose own country was colonized, watching the indigenous people of Australia being treated as a tourist attraction by the white descendants of colonizers.
He recognizes a parallel exile.
That is incredibly complex, real-world sociological observation. But the critic's iron ruler is simply the wrong tool to measure the distance between Colombo and Melbourne.
It really is. Saman Kumara sweeps the entire history of colonialism, migration, and racial contrast under the rug of internal pathology.
He forces the outward-looking poet back into the dark, windowless room of his own mind.
It is so incredibly frustrating to read because the poet is handing the critic the entire world, the mud, the pelicans, the heat, the history, and the critic refuses to look at anything except a textbook.
Which, ironically, perfectly sets up the massive contradiction in the critic's own philosophy regarding how we communicate.
Oh, this is the best part.
The critic spends a huge portion of his essay complaining about the failure of language.
Yes, this is a major philosophical pillar of Saman Kumara's review, and we must explore it because it explains his entire critical posture.
He really goes after language itself.
He does. A running theme throughout his critique is a deep, postmodern distrust of language itself. He argues that language is a torture chamber. He references Lacan, again, calling language a Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse. Meaning, language looks like a gift. It looks like a tool we can use to connect with each other, but it secretly houses enemies that destroy our meaning from the inside out.
Precisely. The critic claims that the poet is trapped in the deadlock of language.
The deadlock.
Gunasekar is trying to express an infinite existential void, the pain of existence. But because words are inherently limited, human constructs, the poet is tortured by his inability to fully capture reality.
Words just aren't enough.
Right. The critic argues that true meaning, the true horror of the real, as Lacan calls it, always slips through the cracks of words. Language can only ever circle the trauma, can never actually touch it.
To really understand what the critic is getting at here, we have to look at the poem that gives the entire collection its title, Beaming Petals in a Henna Vine.
It is arguably the most complex poem in the book.
It is a stunning piece of work, deeply sensory and deeply unsettling.
Walk us through the structure of it.
So, the poem starts by overwhelming your senses with beauty. The poet describes seeing young Lebanese girls. He notes their green, cat-like eyes. He describes their golden skin.
It's very lush.
He talks about the intense, sugary sweetness of baklava. He evokes the ancient, restless, romantic waves of the Mediterranean Sea. He talks about the intricate, beautiful designs of henna vines painted on skin.
It is lush, it is vibrant, it is a celebration of life.
But then, right in the middle of this sensory overload, there is a sudden, violently jarring pivot. Without warning, the poem introduces the image of a dead body.
Just out of nowhere.
He mentions the tragedy of stepping over a corpse in the street.
The contrast is violent. It
Yeah.
gives the reader emotional whiplash.
You have sweet baklava and beautiful green eyes, and then boom, a dead body.
And here, we must synthesize the critic's point, because Saman Kumara is actually onto something profound with this reading.
He finally gets one right.
He does. The critic argues that this violent juxtaposition is the perfect representation of the void, or what Lacan calls the real, the traumatic, unnameable reality of death and meaninglessness that exists beyond our symbolic world.
The stuff we can't talk about safely.
Exactly. The poet builds this beautiful, romantic image using the tools of language. He uses words like petals and baklava to create a safe, beautiful structure. But language cannot protect him.
The reality of the world intrudes.
Yes. The sudden violence, the trauma, the corpse, it shatters the poem from the inside. The critic correctly identifies that Gunasekar is constantly grappling with how hopelessly inadequate language is when it comes to describing true suffering. The words fail.
I see exactly what the critic is saying. I really do. The theory maps perfectly onto the poem. But we have to point out the glaring, massive, almost comical irony in how the critic makes this argument.
Oh, please do. What stands out to you?
Okay, the critic is writing a sprawling 10-page essay arguing that language is a trap. He is arguing that words fundamentally fail to capture reality, that they are a torture chamber of miscommunication.
Yes.
But to make this point, the critic uses the most dense, complex, convoluted, jargon-filled academic language imaginable.
It's so true.
He is burying the reader in words like transgressive, hegemonic, signification, delusional projection, partial objects, and Lacanian deadlock.
He builds a massive, impenetrable fortress of words just to argue that words don't work.
Exactly. Meanwhile, look at the poet. The poet is demonstrating the exact same philosophical concept. The void, the suddenness of loss, the failure of meaning to protect us from death.
But he's doing it differently.
But he doesn't use a single piece of jargon. He does it using simple, devastating physical images. A half-eaten cherry, a silent pelican staring blankly at the mud, a discarded tampon in a trash can. a sudden corpse next to sweet baklava.
It's show, don't tell.
Isn't the poet doing a significantly better job of showing us the limits of language than the critic does by burying us in an academic dictionary?
It is the difference between demonstrating a concept and lecturing on it. The poet shows you the void through absence, through juxtaposition, through stark imagery. The critic tries to explain the void by filling it with academic noise.
It's maddening.
Think of it like this. The poet brings you to a heavy locked door, jiggles the handle, and shows you that we cannot get inside. We are locked out of true meaning.
And the critic?
The critic comes along, sees the locked door, and proceeds to hand you a 500-page technical manual on the metallurgical mechanics of the tumbler inside the lock.
Yes. The poet makes you feel the deadlock of language in your gut. The critic just gives you a headache explaining the theory behind it.
Which perfectly sets up our final evaluation of this entire fascinating literary conversation.
Yeah.
We have watched the critic apply his framework. We have watched him measure the butterfly.
Now for the verdict.
Exactly. What kind of reader is Saman Kumara really? What is the final verdict on his critique of Beaming Petals in a Henna Vine?
Let's start with the successes, because we must be fair to the intellectual rigor he brought to the table. What did he get right?
When Saman Kumara is on point, he is a brilliant, highly perceptive reader. He does not settle for surface-level readings.
No, he digs deep.
He correctly identifies Gunasekera's absolute refusal to romanticize modern life. The critic brilliantly spots that the poet's gaze is decentralized, that Gunasekera is drawn to the broken, the fleeting, the marginalized, the kintsugi of human existence rather than the polished capitalist whole.
And he sees the sadness underneath it all.
He accurately names the underlying, thrumming existential melancholy that dictates the pace of every single poem in this book.
I agree completely. The critic forces us to take the poetry seriously. He refuses to let us read this as just a collection of sad musings. He elevates it to a psychological study.
He opens the text up productively in areas concerning gender, too, showing how the poet subverts the traditional domestic expectations of women, even if we disagree on the poet's underlying motivation for doing so. He spots the rebellion against societal norms.
But then we have the overstretch. We have the heavy iron ruler.
Yes, the critical flaw in Saman Kumara's reading is his rigidity. He imposes a highly European, deeply clinical framework of Lacanian psychoanalysis onto a text that frequently resists it.
He forces the puzzle pieces to fit.
And in his stubborn insistence on making the text fit his theory, he suffocates the fragile, diasporic heartbeat of the poems.
He medicalizes human emotion by constantly labeling the poet as pathological and treating the poetry collection like a literal autopsy of a disease. The critic strips away the simple, profound humanity of the work.
He loses the person behind the text.
He ignores the very real, relatable guilt of a father stealing time from his kids, turning it instead into a case study of neurosis.
And, perhaps most egregiously, he completely erases the specific, localized grief of the immigrant experience.
That part is unforgivable to me.
By treating the Australian landscape, the pelicans, the heat, and the Aboriginal people as mere psychological projections of the poet's inner void, the critic ignores the historical and geographical reality of the diaspora.
He applies a universal theory to a highly specific post-colonial pain, and the theory just fails to capture the truth.
So if we had to synthesize this, we had to summarize what kind of reader this critic is, what would you say?
I would conclude that Saman Kumara often uses Gunasekera's poetry as a mirror to reflect his own theoretical brilliance. He is holding up the poet's book, but he is looking at his own intellect.
That's a great way to put it. To his credit, the angle of that mirror does catch some real light, and it illuminates dark corners of the text regarding desire and the fragmentation of beauty.
But ultimately, he creates a barricade of jargon that keeps the reader away from the raw, beating heart of the poet's lived experience.
He understands the mechanics of the melancholy, but he completely misses the tears. He diagnoses the patient perfectly, but he forgets to ask how the patient is actually feeling.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. But before we go, we want to leave you with a final, lingering thought. Because this entire conversation isn't just about one poet and one critic in Sri Lanka and Australia.
No, it's universal.
It is about how we consume the pain and the art of other people. Think about the journey of a poem. A poet sits in a quiet, dusty room in Melbourne. He feels immense, crushing guilt about ignoring his children.
He feels the sharp sting of isolation when a woman leaves his apartment.
He feels the profound alienation of being a foreigner watching pelicans in the mud. He takes all of that vulnerability, all of that bleeding humanity, and he releases it into the world. He releases his butterfly.
And then the critic comes along.
The critic catches the butterfly, pins it to a corkboard, measures it with a cold iron ruler, and publishes an essay turning that vulnerable human experience into a clinical case study of partial objects and Lacanian neurosis.
When that happens, you have to ask who truly owns the meaning of the poem.
Does the critic's high-level academic analysis elevate the art, giving it the philosophical weight and historical importance it deserves? Or, by stripping away the simple, domestic, messy humanity of the poet's original intent, does the critic actually steal the art from the poet?
It's the butterfly and the iron ruler. We need the ruler to build the frameworks of our world. We need theory to understand the architecture of our minds.
But if you truly want to understand the miracle of flight, you might just have to put the ruler down, step away from the textbook, and simply watch the wings.
Beautifully said.
The next time someone sends you a piece of their heart, whether it's a poem, a piece of art, or just a desperate, guilty text message, ask yourself what tool you are using to read it. Are you trying to diagnose them, or are you trying to feel with them?
Something to really think about.
Something for you to mull over. We'll see you on the next deep dive.